great pleasure to introduce Professor Sarah Emily Duff from the History Department at Colby College. Dr. Duff's research focuses on histories of childhood, Christianity, and sexuality in 19th and 20th century South Africa. She is published in the Journal of Southern African Studies, the South African Historical Journal, the Journal of Colonialism and Colonial History, the Journal of the History of Childhood and Youth, Chronos, as well as several edited collections. Most recently, she's the author of Changing Childhoods in the Cape Colony, Dutch Reformed Church Evangelicalism and the Colonial Childhood, 1860 to 1895. That was published in 2015. Professor Duff holds a doctorate in modern history from Birkbeck, University of London. Before coming to Colby, she taught in universities in South Africa and the UK. Sarah is a native of South Africa. I have seen it where she is referred to Johannesburg as the second greatest city after Paris. But I'm assuming she made that comment before taking up residence in Waterville, Maine, as we all know, often known as the Paris of the Kennebec. We're just so delighted to have her with us here this week. And this afternoon, Dr. Duff will be talking about the British imperial context in Things Fall Apart. And Sarah, we welcome you. Oh, and can I say one more thing, Sarah? About 5 minutes before the end of Sarah's talk, I'm going to be jumping back up on the screen. It's not because anything's wrong or anything like that, but just as her talk comes to an end, I'll be popping back up, so you'll see me again in a little while.
Thank you so much, Hayden and Megan, for that completely fantastic introduction. And so greetings from the Paris of the Kennebec. A description I've not yet heard, but I love it. I have two apologies to offer. The first is that I'm actually sitting on Main Street, Waterville. So if you occasionally you hear traffic, that's what it is. But the other apology I have to make is that I spoke yesterday to my students who I teach at Colby about the fact that I'm going to be doing this presentation today, and because they see my PowerPoint presentations every, twice a week, I ask them, say, what would you suggest? What advice would you give to me, for, these wonderful people who are going to come and listen to some ideas that I have? And there was this awkward silence, and one of my students said, have you considered paying someone to do it for you? And which unfortunately is both honest and indeed may be true. But I feel that I have put together a really good PowerPoint presentation, and it will be available to you after this. I will send it to Megan, who will make it available. I will also make available some extra reading if you would be interested in pursuing some of the ideas that I raise here. And my email address is easily available. Please feel free to drop me a line if you've got specific questions too. I'd absolutely love to help them. I'll answer them. So I'm actually going to share my screen. So I'll quickly do that right now. Here we go. There's my PowerPoint. Okay. And just want to start the slideshow so that you can see it without all the bump around it. There we go. Okay, there we go. There are I'm an historian of South Africa, as you heard, but I teach on African history at Colby College, and I'm interested in the history of the continent more broadly. And my presentation today has been directed by what's in the novel and what I thought it might be useful for you to know in terms of context, but also draws on the fantastic conversation I had with the people in my small group yesterday who had very specific questions. And so my presentation is informed by those questions too. And so I thought that if that small group had those questions, I imagine other people do too. So as usual, being an academic, I've probably prepared far too much. If we don't get through it all, it doesn't matter because you'll have access to this PowerPoint too. But I'm going to focus on some key themes. So I've got just a brief outline here, some of the things that I want to touch on. So I'm going to begin with thinking with Achebe. Then we're going to think about this region of West Africa in the world. Then we're going to think about empire and mission, Christian mission. We had lots of questions yesterday about Christian missionaries in my small group. Then thinking about conquest and resistance. Finally, a very brief mention of capitalism and the transformation of society. And finally, we'll return to Chinua Achebe. So this is just a bit of a roadmap. So you've got a sense of where we're going to be going. All right, so my first question is, what can novelists teach historians, or using things fall apart to understand histories of colonialism and resistance? And I want to begin with a quote taken from a talk given by a very well-known British historian called Hugh Trevor Roper in 1963. He gave this talk at Sussex University, and just note that he's doing this and on the eve of decolonization. You know, Ghana's been independent for a little while. 1960 was declared by France to be the year of Africa. So this is the moment at which African colonies are becoming independent. And he makes this speech. So you can imagine the chutzpah that goes into making this kind of commentary. He says, perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach, but at present there is none, or very little. There is only the history of the Europeans in Africa. The rest is largely darkness, like the history of pre-European, pre-Columbian America. And darkness is not a subject for history. I do not deny that men existed even in dark countries and dark centuries, nor that they had political life and culture interesting to sociologists and anthropologists. But history, I believe, is essentially a form of movement and purpose of movement too, so progress, in other words. If all history is equal, as some now believe, there's no reason why we should study one section of it rather than another, for certainly we cannot study it at all. Then indeed, and I'm afraid that he gets quite racist here, even more racist, then indeed we may neglect our own history and amuse ourselves with the unrewarding gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe. Tribes whose chief function in history, in my opinion, is to show to the present an image of the past by history it has escaped. This is obviously outrageously racist and is given openly in a speech to students and faculty at Sussex University in 1963. So I provide this quote to give you some sense of a context in which Achebe is writing. Now, of course, there are historians at work at African universities in newly independent states who are writing precisely African histories, who take one listen to this and think, what nonsense. But this is a pervasive view about African history in the 1960s, and it's against this which Achebe is writing. There we go. And one of the arguments that Trevor Roper develops and which he believed in is that because African societies many African societies didn't possess systems of writing, that they had no history. And that is, of course, nonsense. All societies all over the world have developed ways of recording their own histories, describing their political and economic systems, for instance. Some use writing, some use oral tradition. Many, although by no means all, African societies relied on oral tradition for this record keeping. There are many African societies that had written traditions too. Oral tradition, particularly as it's used by scholars of Africa, refers to the transmission of a community's account of its origins and deeds, its social and cultural norms, and significant members over time, and often by officially sanctioned individuals. So in some West African societies, there is the figure of the griot, who is a storyteller. And that storyteller is tasked with transmitting the history of those societies from generation to generation. Oral tradition is, of course, entangled in myth and religious practice, and it may alter over time according to who's telling the story, who's listening to the story, and the context in which it's told. And with colonial conquest, those oral traditions were disrupted and occasionally lost. And often then, the historians supplement those traditions with a collection of what we call oral histories, which are the personal accounts of experiences of events or lives given by individuals to historians who are interviewing them. And I have a quote on the right from an article about the difference between oral tradition and oral history in Nigeria. I've got the reference there, so when you take a look at the slideshow on your own, you'll be able to see the longer article too. So, in societies which had an oral tradition, colonial conquest, in many cases, disrupts that tradition. So the question then is, how do historians go about writing the histories of pre-colonial societies? Historians, as you know, interpret the remnants of the past, the bits and pieces of the past that survive into the present, transforming them into what we call history. And in so doing, historians make use of the same tools as novelists and the transmitters of oral tradition. We also use narrative. We also create characters in some ways, although we base them on real people. But historians, unfortunately, as we lament, are always limited by our sources. We can only really tell what we find in archives. We can't make stuff up. So historians interested in pre- and early colonial Africa have to make careful use of sources which themselves sometimes tread a line between fact and invention. And while these sources can provide historians with rich and complex detail, there are some aspects of the past which are harder to grasp, like the texture of everyday life, and particularly, say, the emotional experience of change. And it's here that novelists can do what historians can't. They can imagine, they can extrapolate, they can explore what might have been and what might have been felt. So how do we think then when things fall apart? Things Fall Apart, as you know, was published in 1958, and it addresses itself precisely to scholars like Hugh Trevor Roper. And in this novel, Achebe describes the experience of early colonial conquest in granular, careful detail, which the sources available to historians might not be able to provide. Achebe is clearly aware of what happened as Igbo society confronted missionaries and the representatives of British rule, but he's also freer to speculate. And this speculation helps historians to ask different questions about the past and to approach questions of colonial conquest in different or new ways. So this is my argument for why novels are important for historians. They help us to do the things that we can't actually do when we're limited by our sources. So my first section. There we go. I'm first going to, so I'm being guided by what the novel tells us about the society. And I'm going to begin by thinking about this region of Africa in the world, histories of global interconnection. And my inspiration for this also comes from a question that we, the panelists, were asked yesterday, but which we didn't get to, about yams. Now, I'm afraid I'm not going to say terribly much about yams, but I am going to tell you about some of the other commodities that we find, that we come across in this novel, and which are really important. So we encounter commodities and objects which are fully integrated into Igbo society, but which we know originated elsewhere, and remind us how this region was integrated into global networks of exchange. So, for example, cowrie shells. There are lots of references to cowrie shells, which are used as currency, and they're used as currency throughout West Africa. And they're also incorporated into religious and artistic traditions. But cowrie shells come from the Indian Ocean. They're harvested particularly around the Maldives, and for at least 1,000 years were used as currency around the Indian Ocean, in India and China. And they enter West Africa through two routes. The first route is overland through the Sahara, and the second route is that they brought to West Africa by European traders in the 16th century. And because those European traders, as you know, are arriving on ships, they can carry far more cowrie shells with them. And so cowrie shells, the currency of West Africa, or at least one of the currencies of West Africa, come from elsewhere. So it helps us to begin to build up a portrait of West Africa thoroughly plugged into the rest of the world. We also encounter maize and cassava. Maize is one of the crops that the women grow. Cassava we encounter right at the end. It's also called manioc or tapioca. That we come across it right at the end of the novel, where the women go and dig up some cassava root to feed as Okonkwo and his family move back to their village. And these, in fact, are two crops introduced to West Africa via the Columbian exchange in the 16th and the 17th centuries, and they become staples of West African diets alongside peanuts, for instance. We also know that Okonkwo's troubles are produced partly by his ownership of a gun. And guns and ammunition were traded along the West African coast, and particularly in the 18th century. And I wonder if Okonkwo's misfiring gun was an old model traded long ago, which is why it doesn't function quite as well as it should, or it's a bit unreliable. But all of these commodities, which are totally part of life in this village, come from elsewhere. And so this helps to combat this stereotype that many people hold, that Africa was this dark continent removed from the rest of the world that didn't have any contact with anyone. That is totally untrue. Africans entered into the world, shaped the world as they found it, and incorporated aspects of the world in ways that were useful and interesting and meaningful to them too. West Africa has encounters the world across the Sahara and enters into the Mediterranean world, but it also enters into the Atlantic world. The first West African societies trade with Europeans from 1480, when Portuguese sailors established a trading post in the Benin Kingdom. And while this trade was initially focused on luxuries like textiles and pepper and gold, this region of West Africa has significant gold products. Hayden, I'm not done yet. No, because your video popped up. Okay, never mind. So sorry, I'll continue. It expands to include a range of goods, including metal implements, tobacco, and palm oil. But most importantly, from the 16th century, enslaved people were taken from West Africa to work on plantations in the Americas. Lagos was one of the key ports in this trade, and enslaved people were taken from, in fact, most of the coastline of contemporary Nigeria. So people from the region were pulled into an Atlantic world, and although they were enslaved and experienced the horrible conditions of life in the world of the plantation, they brought with them, for example, religious belief, food technologies like rice production, and cultural and social forms to the Americas, and in so doing constitute a distinctive Atlantic culture. So this is the sort of the global context of our story. Now I'd like to focus in particular on this region. And I thought that I would speak first of all about missionaries, because in the 19th century, this is one of the sort of the major modes through which Africans in this region encounter the rest of the world, Christian missionaries. So the civilizing mission in West Africa. When I see the word civilizing mission, I think of that quote from Gandhi when asked about Western civilization. He responded, "I think it's a good idea." And so let's put civilizing mission there and sort of heavily in quotation marks. Okay. So in Things Fall Apart, Achebe helps us to understand why Africans converted to Christianity. And as he suggests, the first to convert were those on the margins of the Igbo society. And I've got some quotes on the right from the novel describing the fact that the first people to convert were men with no title. A woman who had had several sets of twins who she had been forced to abandon in the forest. Outcasts, the Osu, and I apologize if I mispronounce that, people who are outcasts of society. In his novel Arrow of God, he describes at the end of that novel a mass conversion of a village after a series of bad decisions taken by the main character, who's a chief priest. That chief priest in that novel also sends one of his sons to the local mission school as a rather canny way of building up a link with this new node of power. So Achebe understands the reasons why people would have converted. He also explains to us why Nwoye decides to convert. It's clearly a rebellion against his father. But it's also true that this new religion seems to provide him with some kind of emotional and spiritual balm as he struggles to come to terms with the killing of his adoptive brother and with practices like the abandonment of twins. And so Achebe provides us with this sort of this selection of reasons for why people might want to convert to Christianity. So taking a step back, let's think about the arrival of Christian missionaries in Nigeria. Now, we have to remember, of course, that Christianity is an African religion too. It's been adopted in parts of North Africa and particularly in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, it becomes a state religion in the 4th century. So Christianity is very much an African religion too. But the form of Christianity which is introduced to Africa in the 19th century is part of a global evangelical movement which sweeps the world at the end of the 18th century. Those of you who know the history of the United States might have heard about the Great Awakenings that happened in New England. These Great Awakenings are part of a global movement which animates a massive evangelical project to send missionaries around the world to convert all human beings into Christianity in preparation for the Second Coming. One of the questions that was raised in my small group yesterday was, how is it that Christian missionaries behaved in ways that to us feel so unchristian? And I think that it's important for us to understand that the Christian missionaries of the 19th century meant their project sincerely. They really did believe that they were taking people out of darkness and into light. Being a missionary in the 19th century was not a cushy job. You weren't paid very well. You were often isolated. You were often away from your family for long periods of time. You were often exposed to disease. Now, whether we think that it was a good or a bad thing to be a missionary at the time, that's one set of questions. But we have to understand that missionaries went into lives that were hard. And they did this because they genuinely believed in the righteousness of their project. And that helps for us to understand why it is that they did things and said things that to us seem just so absolutely counterintuitive if you are a Christian. So Nigeria and Africa more broadly are pulled into this evangelical project in the 19th century. Missionaries identify imperialism as a tool for the expansion of Christianity. And so we have to, and empires on their side justify their expansion on the grounds of the civilizing mission. Now, even as colonial administrators argued that they were out to civilize the people whose societies they conquered and governed, we must know that, in fact, most of the work of so-called civilizing, so building schools and hospitals, for instance, converting people, that was actually done by missionaries themselves, and it was funded by churches and by missionary societies. So in some ways, missionaries did the work of empire, and they also helped to expand empire by sometimes working as agents of empire, signing treaties, for instance, with local leaders. So empire and the project of empire and the project of missionary work were absolutely entangled with one another. So what were missionary attitudes towards Africans? Achebe gives us two missionaries, Mr. Brown and Mr. Smith, one of whom is interested in Igbo society, one of whom is not at all interested in Igbo society and thinks of it as a culture that needs to be cleared in order for Christianity to take root. And so missionaries approach their work and their potential converts with a range of attitudes shaped by their denominations, their own particular interests, and their own particular preoccupations. But overwhelmingly, Christian missionaries argued that African religions led only to sinfulness, while Christianity was the pathway to salvation. They also argued that conversion was not only a spiritual process, it was a process that required a conversion of your whole being, your whole way of life. To be a Christian was to dress, to look, and to speak like a European. Christian converts spoke European languages, wore European dress, lived in square houses, not round walled houses. They observed a European division of labor, with women staying at home and men going out to work. So being Christian didn't only mean converting to Christianity, it meant living in a different way, which is why conversion to Christianity was such a profound act. And it's true that mission schools were crucial for the emergence of an African middle class in the colonial era, and from whose ranks came the first anti-colonial nationalist politicians. And it's partly for this reason that missionaries are often regarded with some suspicion by colonial states. They were seen as being too close to Africans, while at the same time, many Africans viewed missionaries as being too close to the colonial state. So they were viewed with some suspicion by both sides. So, Christian missionaries in Nigeria then. The Portuguese, in fact, introduced Christianity to the West African coast in the 15th century. And you may know about a massive African kingdom that converts to Catholicism in Central Africa, largely in what is now Angola, the Kingdom of the Congo. I mean, we spell that Congo with a K. That's a Catholic kingdom that is established in Central Africa in the 15th century. But Christianity, 19th century Christianity, really kind of is introduced in the 1840s. And it's introduced initially to Yorubaland, the Church Missionary Society, the Wesleyan Missionary Society from Britain, and then the Southern Baptist Mission from the United States established mission stations in Yorubaland. And stations were founded in Igbo territory in the following decade, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So why were missionaries able to establish their work along their coast and then into the interior? Importantly, African leaders understood that mission education was useful in facilitating trade with British merchants. If people could speak English and read and write it, that was useful. So this was strategically useful. These same leaders believed that missionaries could work as intermediaries between themselves and the British. Also, missionaries went to work producing Igbo and Yoruba as written languages and translating the Bible into vernacular languages. And so this helped with training the first African converts as evangelists and as preachers who could communicate Christianity more effectively to the people of the region. So I wanted to give you an example of one very well-known Yoruba missionary and churchman, Samuel Ajayi Crowther. Like so many African missionaries, he was many African missionaries of the sort of first generation in the early 19th century were people who had been freed from enslavement and had been settled in Sierra Leone, a British colony, where they were converted to Christianity. So Crowther had been born in Yoruba land, and he was enslaved as a child during a period of profound political upheaval. I'll talk about that more in a moment. The ship that was carrying him to the Americas was intercepted by the Royal Navy. So this is after the abolition of the slave trade in Britain in 1807. And Crowther was taken to Sierra Leone. Then he's in his teens, and he's baptized into the Anglican Church in Freetown, the capital of Sierra Leone, in 1825. He returns to Yoruba land in 1841 as a member of the Niger expedition, which is the first concerted attempt to introduce Christianity into Nigeria. He establishes a number of mission stations and is the first African bishop of the Anglican Church and was named the Bishop of Niger in 1862. So he's a fairly typical figure. Many of this generation of missionaries were freed enslaved people, many of whom had links to Sierra Leone, who then returned to Nigeria, bringing Christianity with them. And so he helps us to tell a story about the fact that, in fact, some of the first Christian missionaries to Igbo land were, in fact, African. And Achebe narrates that as well. So the first missionaries in Igbo land are linked to the Church Missionary Society. It's a British organization. And Crowther establishes a mission at Onitsha in 1857. And it's placed under the leadership of John Christopher Taylor, who had had a similar kind of upbringing and background to Crowther. He'd also been enslaved, had also been raised in Sierra Leone, but he was of Igbo descent, hence him being placed in Igbo land. Before the imposition of colonial rule, it's the CMS and then the Catholic Church are the only missionaries who are working among the Igbo people. And Christianity takes a long time, actually, to take root in Igbo land. There's relatively little interest in it among Igbo people. I should also say that missionaries could only work with the support and permission of chiefs, that they were granted land, and that land was always understood, in fact, always to still be held by Igbo people themselves, that the church couldn't take land from Igbo society. So then, how do Igbo people respond to Christianity? Well, as Achebe tells us, the people who were the least likely to convert were elders. People, particularly those who had status, people who were priests and adult men and women who were fully incorporated into the systems of Igbo society. Those people who had the least to lose from changing the status quo converted first, as well as those people who had not been fully initiated into communities. So members of the Osu caste, children and young men and young women who still had to complete the processes of initiation, which would bring them fully into the community, and people who had been marginalized for a range of reasons. So nearly all of the children who attend mission schools convert to Christianity. And so mission education becomes the most important vehicle for conversion to Christianity in Igbo land. Christian schools, mission education is much more easily available from around 1915, and it really takes off in the 1920s and the 1930s, when greater numbers of parents send their children to school, believing that education was a useful route into careers as teachers and clerks and so on in this new colony. And by 1960, most Igbo people describe themselves as Christian. But what does Christian actually mean in this context? I've got a long quote here from a wonderful essay called Religious Change Among the Igbo in the Colonial Period by, in fact, an Igbo historian. He writes, the victory of Christianity was only very partial, and in some respects quite superficial. Undoubtedly, belief in the supreme being, this time the Christian supreme God, became part of the Igbo religious consciousness. But this supreme being could not show convincingly the reasons why he should be worshipped to the exclusion of all other spirits. For in their millions, both the converts and those born into Christianity could not find in Christianity solutions to many of the problems that confronted them in everyday life. This meant or the continued relevance of the deities and the ancestors who still intervened in their affairs in the way the Christian God did not or could not. Thus, most Christians still participated and believed in the efficacy of sacrifices to the deities and the ancestors. Disputes in the village communities were still referred to the deities for just and final decisions, and for the ancestors, their return through reincarnation and their continued interest in the affairs of their descendants was still taken for granted. Whatever the missionaries might have taught them, the Igbo treated elements of Christianity as one more addition to the large corpus of their religious world. The average Igbo of this period, and he's talking about the colonial period, was not a Christian in the missionary sense of the word, and he was not a follower of the traditional religion in the manner of his ancestors, but he remained a religious man nonetheless. Having taken, and we, of course, woman, person, this is written in the 1980s, so different way of writing about humans. But he remained a religious man nonetheless, having taken from both religions what he considered useful and helpful to him. Put in another way, religion to him meant some of the teachings of Christianity enriched by some traditional religious beliefs. So Christianity is introduced, is received in complicated ways. It's not necessarily an imposition of one way of thinking about the world over people who accept it or reject it wholesale. Rather, it's a piecemeal taking and rejecting of what people might find useful. So if that's the experience of Christianity, what is the experience of colonial rule? Because as we've seen, Christianity and colonial rule are entangled with one another. So I'm going to talk now about conquest and resistance, constituting Nigeria and anti-colonial rebellion. Okay. So Nigeria before the conquest, this, frankly, we could spend a whole week, a whole month, a whole year even on this. This is a tremendously complex and diverse region constituted of a variety of states and different language groups, and all connected into the vast trading networks which incorporated the Atlantic and Mediterranean and Saharan worlds. I'm going to look at Nigeria just before colonial conquest, just to kind of lay that ground. And I've got a map in a moment to show you, which will help. So by the second half of the 19th century, much of what is now northern Nigeria was under the rule of the Sokoto Caliphate, a Muslim empire, which had begun the process of introducing Islam to the communities which inhabited this largely savanna region. Islam has existed in West Africa for many centuries and had been Africanized and incorporated into life in the region. So that's in the north of Nigeria. In the south, the collapse of the major Yoruba state, the Oyo Empire, which had dominated the south of what is now southern Nigeria for a very long time, in the first half of the 19th century, as a result of politics within that empire, produced political and social disorder. And it's in this that the British managed to find a path into the region, as different political groupings fought for dominance. Igbo society, a third group, and of course there are other ethnic groups in Nigeria, I'm just focusing on these three, was never dominated by a state. Instead, it was governed by councils on a village level, where all adults had representation to varying degrees. Much of southern Nigeria had been pulled, as we've seen, into the trade in enslaved people, and the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire in 1807 had a profound effect on the region's economy as it shifted to focusing on different products. So here we have this region. So the pink bits are British. You can see, so what is now Nigeria is constituted actually of three British protectorates or colonies. The colony of Lagos and the surrounding Yoruba land, southern Nigeria, which includes Igbo land, and then northern Nigeria, which includes the Sokoto Caliphate. So I think that it's really worth noting, and this is not only true of Nigeria, it's true of many post-colonial states. I mean, this includes states in Asia, like India, for instance, that the idea of Nigeria as a place is in fact a colonial construct. And those of you who've read the wonderful novel, Half of the Yellow Sun, will be very familiar with it. There's a lot of debate about this in the novel, about what is Nigeria. So it's this amalgamation of these three regions, which are conquered by the British. There's no actual sort of logic for why these borders are drawn in the way that they were. These are the consequences of the introduction of colonial rule. Britain had long had an interest in the region because of trade, and first in the trade in enslaved people. And with the end of the slave trade, Britain's interest shifts to a trade in palm products, and particularly in palm oil. So by far the most vocal group of people encouraging greater British presence in the region were missionaries. They wanted to replace the slave trade with what they called legitimate commerce, which they believed would bring Christian civilization to the people of Nigeria. And British businessmen formed a second constituency, lobbying hard for greater British control over trade in the region as competition with local traders and between British businesses intensified. It's really worth emphasizing that the British rely heavily on African knowledge of the region and on African middlemen to do this trade. Malaria poses a threat to the health of Europeans in the region. This is before the discovery of what I call quinine, but which I believe all of you call quinine, which is a useful medicine in combating malaria if you don't have a resistance to it. And the British and other Europeans have actually got very little awareness of the geography of the region. So they really do rely very heavily on African middlemen. There's also increasing competition between European powers in West Africa. So Britain is concerned about the growing French and German presence in West Africa. We call this the scramble for Africa, which really sort of gets going in the 1880s. So the reason for the British conquest of Nigeria is it's partly produced by the missionaries, it's partly produced by traders, and it's partly produced by this sort of competition between European nation states. Right. So I'm relying here on probably the best known US-based historian of Nigeria, Toyin Falola from Nigeria himself, to narrate how Britain conquers this region, because it is a very long and very complex process, and he writes with great elegance. So I think that he can tell us the story. So he says, the spread of Christian missionaries and British trading interests, and after the 1880s, the need to keep out French and German interests dovetailed, influencing, influencing the decisions of the consuls appointed to oversee British affairs in the coastal states of the Bights of Benin, Biafra, to interfere more and more heavily in the local politics of the coastal states, the southern parts of Nigeria from the 1850s. Interference in local politics eventually led to direct British control of the coastal states between 1861 and 1885. Having annexed the coasts, British political interests moved inland, adding to their existing protectorates, the Yoruba states and the states on the rivers Niger and Benue. The activities of Sir George Goldie's chartered Royal Niger Company, chartered meaning that it represented the British state, were instrumental in gaining ultimate control of the Niger and Benue for the British. With the Niger secured by 1900, British military might turned its attention towards the emirates of the Sokoto Caliphate. In a series of offensives led by Frederick Lugard, and I'll tell you more about him in a moment, the British forces finally brought down the Caliphate, killing the Caliph in battle in July 1903, and thereby bringing under British imperial control the lands that were soon to make up a fully amalgamated Nigerian protectorate. The colonization of Nigeria took over 40 years to complete. It's a long and complicated process. So, the British conquest of Nigeria rested on its willingness to use violence to seize power. And yet, regardless, even after 1903, people within the region continued to resist the imposition of British rule. British military might, its navy, its cannons, and its machine guns made it a formidable force. The British also made use of diplomacy, signing strategic alliances with particular leaders, assisting them in local struggles. Igbo land, in fact, becomes a site of significant resistance to British rule. As a decentralized state, there was no single leader or elite for the British to defeat. In the western region of Igbo land, the Ekumeku system reigned, and this was a communal defense system which mobilized forces from surrounding communities when one community was under military threat. It was defeated only in 1909 by an overwhelming British force, and was defeated with enormous bloodshed and violence. So there were a variety of African responses to the imposition of rule. It was often violent, But there were often strategic alliances that were signed between the British and various states, often after leaders had seen the violence with which Britain imposed its rule over regions. And in an attempt to avoid violence, treaties might have been a useful way of possibly avoiding that kind of conflict. But we have to understand that people in this region resisted British rule as much as they possibly could. So what does British rule look like? And then I'm going to give you one example of one conflict. So Nigeria is actually very important for the development of British rule across Africa. So I've got a picture over here of the front cover of a book called The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa, written by that man Lugard, who I mentioned earlier. So particularly in its African colonies, Britain made use of a system of governments described as indirect rule. And it was developed by officials in South Africa and northern Nigeria. Now, for once, I will not talk about South Africa. I will only talk about Nigeria. And this, Lord Lugard, in his book, The Dual Mandate, published in 1922, he became the governor of Nigeria, advocates for the use of pre-existing African systems of government in ruling conquered societies. So Lugard drew on the experience of establishing rule over the Sokoto Caliphate, where the elite allied eventually with the British and governed on their behalf. The Caliphate took over the collection of taxes for the British, which in many ways was the most important aspect of colonial rule for the British. Lugard advocated for the system of using pre-existing forms of government on the grounds that it preserved what he believed to be traditional African society and culture. And he was really, really suspicious of an emergent English-speaking, mission-educated African elite. And he argued that this system should be elaborated across African societies and British colonies. But the problem was that most African societies in no way bore any resemblance to the Sokoto Caliphate. So in fact, as a result, British administrators invent political systems if none existed in order to govern through them with new local elites created by the British collecting taxes and rounding up labor. The British do this because it's a way of governing on the cheap. So now I'm going to give you an example of rule, and I have to mention indirect rule, so to help you make sense of what we're going to talk about now. So this is the Aba Women's War. It happens in 1929. I mentioned it yesterday. So Igbo society, as in fact we discussed yesterday, pre-colonial Igbo society possessed institutions which allowed most adults some form of representation, and that included women. Women's livelihood in Igbo society came from trading in markets. And there were meeting spaces or meetings called mikiri, where women could gather to discuss business. In these meetings, in these mikiri, women could decide to sanction particular men. So men who were bad husbands, who might beat up their wives, who might abuse their power in some way. Also, young men who might misbehave at markets, that they could choose to sanction men in these mikiri. And they had at their disposal a range of tools for asserting their own power, such as strikes or protest. And they could also communicate their decisions to councils led by men. So these were a place where women could represent their own interests. With the imposition of British rule, Igbo land, the British, of course, are totally unaware of any of these systems. And Igbo land is divided into what they call native court areas, which lump together villages, which often had very little to do with one another. And these areas were then overseen by British district officers and British appointed warrant chiefs. And these are local African men who are appointed by the British to represent the British government. Totally ignores women's own systems of representation. And so in November and December 1929, women in southern Igbo land initiate the Women's War in protest against the arbitrary rule of warrant chiefs, who are hugely resented, and the introduction potentially of the taxation of women. And of course, women are trading on markets, they have an income, and they object to being taxed by the British state. Coordinated by Mikiri, women burned British administrative buildings. They cause something like £70,000 worth of damage, and they attack the warrant chiefs. The British response at first is complete confusion and amazement. They have absolutely no idea what's going on. But then they get their act together, and their response is brutal and deadly, and they kill more than 50 women and hurt more than 50 women in the violence that ensues. The British do so-called reform the system of rule over Iberland in the early 1930s. And their reform consists of fully taking away women's authority and their systems by which they would represent themselves. But I use the example of the Women's War as a powerful example of how Africans continue to resist colonial rule, even at enormous cost to themselves. And this is recent, this is in the 1920s, late 1920s. Okay, I see that I'm running out of time. So I'm going to just briefly mention the fact that Achebe refers to the introduction of a village shop. Capitalism arrives with colonial rule, and it also transforms African societies. One of the reasons it is so transformative is precisely because of the collecting of taxes. Taxes usually had to be paid in cash, and to earn cash, people had to enter into a wage economy, into wage labor. And that meant usually leaving the countryside for cities. And so this begins a process of transforming African societies. So, concluding thoughts. And I've got 3 final questions. My first question is, demonstrates that, or my first consideration is that Christianity is a complex phenomenon, clearly linked to colonial conquest, but also attractive to many of the characters for a range of reasons. It's introduced by African missionaries, although it's also part of a racist colonial project. It offers a balm to those at the same time on the margins of Igbo society. As Achebe describes the imposition of colonial rule was both gradual and spectacular in terms, and by spectacular I mean really violent, particularly in British officials' ready embrace of violence when necessary. There's no spectacular arrival of the British. It's slow, but it's violent at the same time. But Achebe also asks us to understand what it is like to live through this imposition, with very little sense of what British rule was or what it would become. As Achebe asks us to think more carefully about time, about how we might judge people who do not know the future, and to question the degree to which we evaluate the past based on our own knowledge of how things turn out. We know what the end of the story is. We know about decolonization. We know about what happens in the Second World War and the First World War. We know all of this. So how do we judge people on their own terms? And so I'm going to end on that point and say thank you very much for all of your time. I will now not enjoy the sound of my own voice to some extent. Thank you.
Professor Duff, thank you so much.
Well, let me stop my screen, sorry.
Okay.
And you're welcome, thank you so much.
Hey, so we are gonna hear more from you later on tonight at 8 o'clock with Tope Falerian. I just can't help myself though. Can I ask you one quick question?
Please do.
So you started by wondering how can we've just seen how the historian can help the normal reader of a novel.
Yes.
My understanding of this novel is richer now than it was an hour ago.
Good, I'm glad. Hurrah. Good.
But so that question stands. You started by talking about historians having a hard time grasping the texture of everyday life, which is just that's the purview of the novelist, the imaginative way of knowing. For you as a historian, to what extent can the novelist help you as historian do your work? And I know it's unfair for me to ask that because we're on supper break, but
I will give a very, very quick answer. I refer again to Christianity, that it's very easy for us to judge with the condescension of history people who might convert to Christianity and say, how could you sell out in that way? Why did you give in to this? And Achebe lays out for us the emotional experience of converting to Christianity. After you've seen what Nuea has been through, how can you judge him? And I think that that's what novelists do. They are able to help us to understand the emotional experience of navigating an impossible situation. And it makes us less quick to judge.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for listening.
And I think Megan now is going to come. Yeah. Hi, Megan.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. Hayden, as Hayden made reference to a supper break. Yes, indeed. This is our early bird special supper break. We are breaking now at 5 o'clock. We'll be back at 6:15. for Tope Folarin's presentation, and then, as Hayden mentioned, we'll have a moment for a facilitated discussion like we had last night, followed by a conversation between Sarah and Tope. So that'll, and after that, don't go away. Even at 8:30, there's going to be one more exciting thing: the ballot reveal for voting for Readers Retreat 2022 will round out our evening. As we go into supper, our technical wizard is about to open for us a set of breakout rooms that will be named after all of those birds. There will be an abundance of breakout rooms. You can go and be an ostrich with the ostriches or a tortoise with the tortoises. And those breakout rooms are you're able to enter and leave them at will. So for the facilitated groups, we control your spaceship. But for these free choice breakouts, you can do it. And so the way to do it, as soon as they're open, and I wonder if it's worth opening those up if they're not already, great. So if you go down, there should be a spot that says breakout rooms. If you take your mouse down where you would stop your video or open the chat, you should see a spot that says breakout rooms, and you'll see a list of birds. If you go over, like mouse over one of those birds, if you go to the right, there'll be a number, possibly it's 0 because no one's in there yet. But if you put your mouse over the number, certainly if you're on a Mac, it'll turn into the word join. And so you are more than welcome to join any bird room you like and chat with whoever's there, share a meal if you'd like, say hello and leave again. So those rooms are really just open for you to use. We'll close them again when we come back at the end of supper. But in the meantime, I wish you a lovely hour and a bit. So again, 6:15 is when we'll be back for the next presentation, and then the rest of our evening together. Cool.
See you all in a little while.
Okay.
Sarah, thank you again. It was terrific.
Thank you.
Oh, you look like you're muted.
If anybody needs some help, please just speak up.
We can't see the thing we're supposed to click on to find the breakout rooms.
So I think, is there one in particular that I could put you in one if you like?
Well, we're going to go get dinner, but will it be necessary when we resume at 6:15 to be able to do this instruction that Sarah gave about the breakout rooms? Because
No, when we get back, that will be the end of dinner, and then we'll be ready for the final, the big keynote tonight.
okay, and so we'll just sit here just as we have, and we'll be brought in, I guess.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I think that's what we'll probably do.
Have
Okay.
a wonderful dinner.
Thank you. Hope you get some.